This tutorial is part of a YouTube playlist. You can access this and many more of the tutorials in this course. If you do like this YouTube playlist and you want to access the whole course, you can do on Udemy. The link to the YouTube playlist and YouTube course is in the video description. Now that we have the database in place, we can start thinking about actually building ways for users to interact with the database. So maybe saving data to the database or querying and returning data from the database. So here we're going to be utilizing Flask's blueprints. This is a way for us to organize our Flask application into smaller reusable components or modules. We are going to be quite creative how we utilize blueprints. They can be utilized in many different ways, but ultimately they are there, like I said, to help organize our application into smaller reusable components or modules. Now, there are 3 steps of utilizing a blueprint. First of all, we need to create a blueprint, very simple, and then we go ahead and define our routes and views. So this is the actual mechanics of how we define what API endpoints we're going to be building so that users can interact with our database and data. And then the final step is that we then need to register our endpoints or blueprints, so that we can then access the endpoints that we've defined in the blueprint. Blueprints are fairly simple to work with. The most complicated part is working out how we're going to integrate it within our application. So let's take a look. Right, so let's get back into our project. Let's jump into the core initialization file. Now, this is where we register and initialize any of the extensions and so on when we create a new Flask instance. So this is going to be the final step of this process. So we're going to start off in the API or the inventory API folder, and it's currently empty. In this folder, that's where we're going to store all the logic, business logic for our API, inventory API. So inside of here, we're going to define all of our routes, that being the actual endpoints for us to actually retrieve or send data to the database through our API system. So inside of here, we're going to create a new file. So let's go ahead and create an init file for this. Okay. Yep. And this is where we're going to start defining our blueprints. So the first thing we need to do is create a blueprint. So from Flask, we simply import blueprint. Okay. So now we need to build a blueprint. So let's call this inventory. So this is going to be a blueprint for working with the category table. So when we want to return data from the category table, we're going to define it all within this blueprint. So let's go API and then blueprint. So that's what we're going to call it. So that's going to equal, and that is a blueprint. And now we just need to define a few things. So the first argument here, that's going to be, let me just drop that down. The first argument here is going to be the name of the blueprint. So I'm going to call this inventory category API. So that's the name of our blueprint. And then second to that, we can define the name, which is going to be the special built-in variable that represents the name of the current module. So when a Python script or module is executed, Python automatically sets the name variable for the script or the module. So let's pass in name. Now, the purpose of this is to help Flask find maybe any templates or static files associated with this blueprint. In our case, we won't necessarily have any static files or templates, but that's just something to consider if you are utilizing blueprints and you are building maybe a traditional website. So what we've done now is we've created our first blueprint. And like I mentioned, it allows us to break or organize our application into smaller reusable components. So essentially what we're doing here is we're building a small component dedicated to the category. We're going to be building API or relevant API endpoints for the category table in this instance. So now we need to move to the next step, which is now to define the actual business logic. within, shall we say, this blueprint, or for this blueprint. So that includes any routes and any views. So what we're going to do now inside of our inventory API, let's go ahead and create a new file. Let's call this routes.py. So do let me know if the whiteboards have been useful so far, but let's just try and visualize what we're trying to do here. If it wasn't clear to you, or if you haven't utilized or built an API before. So generally what happens, maybe this is like the front end. So that might be some sort of JavaScript front end. So maybe React, Next.js or something like that. So we have our application here, and generally what happens is that it requests some data. Okay, so it asks or requests some data from the API system. So obviously we're building an API with Flask, so this is our API system. So what we're trying to build now is some endpoints. So the front end may require data about a particular product. Okay, so the front end makes a request for data about a particular product. So what it's going to do is it's going to send a request for that. Now, typically that request is in the form of a URL. So maybe we have a website called shop.com, and then it's made a request to /API/ and then the product ID. So let's say the product ID is 12. Okay, so that URL is sent to our Flask server, and it makes a match. So it inspects the URL. So our Flask application inspects this URL, finds this URL path here, and it matches it to what we're going to describe as a view, so to a function. And that function is then going to perform the task of actually then extracting data related to product number 12 from the database. So it's going to grab that data from the database, and then it's going to then return it back to the front end. So what we need to do now is actually build the logic so that we can perform this query, for example, on the database, and then return the data back to the front end. Now, it doesn't have to be a JavaScript framework at the front end. We can actually call this endpoint manually and return the data, and we'll take a look at that shortly. But what we're trying to do now is build the actual logic so that when we receive any requests for data, and that doesn't necessarily mean we are going to be retrieving data all the time. It might be that we're actually adding data into the database. So it works both ways. But we want to build a logic so we can perform these operations and actually then return that data to any requests that are made. So now we need to associate all the endpoints that we want to make for the category to our blueprint. So let's take the name of this blueprint, go back to the roots. We're going to use the name as a declarator over our function. And then let's go ahead and build a function. We haven't finished that yet, but let's go ahead and build a function. Let's call this category, for example. And then inside of here will be our logic. So we would maybe run some sort of query related to the endpoint here and return the data. So I'm just going to add pass for now, just a placeholder. So in addition to the blueprint name, we also need to define route. So this is going to be a route that we're going to associate this business logic, this function with. So that's going to be /category. And then we want to then define what type of methods are allowed, or what type of methods should be associated to this function. So methods equals, and then we're going to define get. So in Flask, methods get, this argument is used when defining routes to specify which HTTP methods are allowed for accessing that route. So in this case, just the get method. So this indicates that this route will only respond to HTTP get requests. Okay, so there are different types. So we can handle both get and post, for example. So we're just going to start with get for now. So what's happening here then is that we have a client. So that might be, like we mentioned in the previous whiteboard, that might be a JavaScript client, a website of some sort, but we're making a request for data in our system. So typically a HTTP GET request is a request made by the client to retrieve data from the server. So we send a GET request to a URL endpoint. So in this case, it's going to be the shop.com API category. Okay, so that then goes into the application, or we retrieve that within our server. That then gets passed to our Flask application, and then we inspect the URL. So if we can make a match with the URL, in this case, it's going to be /category. So because we've built this route here and we've defined /category, that's going to make a match. And we then check to make sure it's a GET request. It is a GET request that's being requested. Therefore, we're now going to deal with that request within our function. So now we just need to build some logic within our function, grab some data, and then return it back to the user. Okay, so let's first of all just connect everything up. So from dot import the inventory API blueprint. Okay, so that connects everything up. So we've created our blueprint. Remember, this is in the initialization file. So it means that when we call the inventory API, this will get initialized, and then we can access it in our blueprint in the root. And obviously, we've defined an endpoint now within our blueprint so that potentially users can now access data, return data from the database. Of course, we're going to need a query. We'll sort that out shortly. But we have the first two steps now in place, building a blueprint, and then we've now started to assign a route to that blueprint so that then we can perform some custom logic. So what we want to do when we create a new Flask instance, we want to make sure that we initialize our blueprint. So we want to call the inventory app module, which has the initialization function. So when we call the inventory API, this is going to be initialized. Our blueprints are going to be initialized. So let's just close down everything. Let's go back into the, just fold that down. We know we are. So let's go back into the core and then the initialize file. So down at the bottom here, let's go ahead and create, maybe we could put it here in the extensions, but not necessarily an extension. So let's create a new function here to register the blueprint, pass in our app, and then we're going to from core.inventory API, because that's where our blueprints are. Let's go ahead and import our blueprints. So at the moment, we just have one, and that's the inventory category API blueprint. And now what we can do is then associate that with a URL prefix. So let's go ahead and say app.register blueprint. And then let's say the inventory category blueprint. And then we can then set a URL prefix, URL underscore prefix equals. So let's go for /API. So what we've done here is we've added a prefix. So you can see in this domain name, we've added the API before the /category. So this is just a prefix before us utilizing any other paths within our URL to identify the routes. So now whenever we initialize our app, we need to make sure that we register our blueprints. So within our create app here, let's go ahead and do exactly that. So let's call the register blueprint, pass in our app, and there we go. So our app will be created. New instance of our app will be created. Obviously, we pass in our custom config. We initialize our extensions, our database, and now we are also registering our blueprints. So the workflow from there, of course, we are calling from core inventory app, this inventory app module, which means that when we call this, the initialization file will be initialized. We're obviously creating a new blueprint, and then we then have the routes readily available for that particular blueprint. So I've gone ahead and updated our diagram. So now we have blueprints. So we've defined one blueprint at the moment. That's the inventory category API blueprint. So when we create a new instance of our Flask, when we create a new Flask instance, we have the blueprint initialized. Now that means that we now have a Flask instance created which includes the custom configurations, our SQLAlchemy database setup, migration and models, and blueprints. So that is obviously passed into the Flask server. And now inside of this server, our Flask application is ready to serve endpoints, API endpoints that we have defined within our blueprints.